1 Kings chapter 17. We're going to be dropping anchor in this book for about 8 weeks in this this remarkable man. 1 Kings 17. Have you ever noticed how much of the Bible is biographical in nature? That is to say, rather than simply being a handbook on theory or a textbook on theology, the Bible really is a storybook of personalities. Men and women, ordinary garden variety believers who encountered God in their lives and sought to bring that into play with their daily experiences. Biographies. Biblical biographies never fail to move me. I read the story of David and Deborah, of Esther and Daniel, and my spiritual tongue hangs out. I think, man, they so encourage me to live lives of steadfastness and faithfulness. By the same token, I look at some of the negative examples of Judas and Demas and the rich young ruler, and I look at their foolishness, short-sightedness, and I think, boy, I want to learn from them as well as how not to do life. Well, over the next weeks, we're going to focus on one of the true biblical heavyweights. His name was Elijah, and he was a remarkable man. And I'm convinced that if we lean into this with our hearts, minds, and souls, we will be changed. Because this guy knew what it was like to stand tall in the darkest of days, to courageously maintain a stance for God in the midst of a godless culture. As such, I think we'll learn much. It's rightly been said that the darker the day, the brighter the light that is needed. Isn't that true? We found that during the grim days of the Civil War, in all those clouds of darkness, it was Abraham Lincoln. In the darkness of World War II, especially when England was brought to her knees by the Blitzkrieg in London, who was it that brought England back up? Winston Churchill. In the racially charged 1960s, when hate flowed so freely, there was a man who stood for God and for good as it relates to the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King. The darkest of the days allow for the lightest of the lights. It was in the time of Israel's darkest era that one of her brightest lights came to bear. To gain an understanding of this man, we need to take a look at the culture in which he lived. So let me give you a little bit of background about Israel's history, and then I'll put Elijah into it. The nation of Israel changed from a group of confederated tribes into a nation around 1000 BC. 3 kings had the United Kingdom at their disposal: Saul, David, and Solomon. They each reigned for roughly 40 years. Solomon, the last king, extended Israel's boundaries to its greatest maximum. As such, Israel was now successful, safe, and flourishing economically. On all borders, her soldiers stood fast. The trading ships plied the Mediterranean Sea. Israel was strong. It was not to last. Upon Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam took the throne. Solomon had had to tax his people heavily in order to finance all of his soldiers and trade. So Rehoboam's older counselors, the wise old men, said, "Son, you want to win these folks' hearts? Ease their tax burden. Back off the levies, and they will serve you with all their hearts." Sadly, Rehoboam had some other counselors, his peers. They said, in effect, "Hey, buddy, you're on the throne now. Show him who's boss. Stick it to him." Guess who he listened to? His young friends. The result was a smoldering resentment in the kingdom, and another figure, a leader, arose. His name was Jeroboam. Dialogue began between the two camps. Diplomacy soon broke down. Civil war broke out. At the end of that bloody civil war, Israel was divided into 2 parts. The north was called Israel proper. Its capital was Samaria. The southern tribes took the name Judah, and they retained the capital of Jerusalem. Notice how the boundaries have been reduced. And that's because all of the enemies began to get emboldened, and they pushed in the borders. Israel is now divided and weak. The southern kingdom had multiple kings. This was the era of the kings and many of the prophets. Some of the kings in the south were bad. A few were good. Have you ever heard the names of Hezekiah, Josiah, Jehoshaphat, Asa? They were good kings. The north had 0 good kings. That kingdom began a spiritual tailspin. You can see the chart there on the screen. Jeroboam began, followed by Nadab, Baasha, Elah, Zimri, and Omri. Over the next 58 years, they took Israel further and further downward. The darkness grew more and more pervasive. Rampant idolatry and open immorality just flourished in the land. We see this in the 16th chapter. Go back just a few verses from chapter 17 to chapter 16, verse 29, because the worst was yet to come. 1 Kings 16:29. In the 8th year of Asa, king of Judah, remember I mentioned him? He was one of the good kings of the south. In his 38th year, Ahab, son of Omri, became king over Israel. He reigned in Samaria, that's the capital of the north, 22 years. You may want to underline verse 30. Ahab, the son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He was the worst king of all time. By himself, Ahab would have been a threat. He was an opportunist. He had 0 moral scruples, no principles. He was in it for the money. As such, he used and abused freely. The thing is, he was not alone. Just as Clyde Barrow had Bonnie Parker, Ahab had his Bonnie. Anybody want to guess what her name was? Jezebel. Verse 31. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he'd built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole. He did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him. Jezebel was a Sidonian princess. Sidon was a seaport on the eastern end of the Mediterranean, great trading city. Why did Ahab marry her? Well, one, it was against God's law to do so, but that hadn't stopped him before. He married her for 2 reasons. One, it secured his western flank. Remember I showed how the enemies were pressing in? The western flank would have now been secure with that alliance. Moreover, he had the opportunity to now have the trade city of Sidon at his disposal. And so he made money. The thing is, when Jezebel came in, she did not come without her thoughts. Her father, Ethbaal, was not only the king of the Sidonians, he was the high priest of the cult of Baal worship. You ever heard of Baal worship? She would have been steeped in that, and she was not content to have her own little private worship. She was determined that she would bring Baal worship fully into Israel, and with missionary zeal, she sought to wipe out all the memory of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When she came in, she brought 200 high priests, dotted the land with temples and shrines. If you wonder what Baal might have looked like, we've got a few representations here. See the first one. His name literally means Lord or Master. Baal was the god of rain and thunder. Very important in this land, rain. Baal was who you worshipped to get the rain to come. His consort, the female version, if you will, was known as Asherah. She was the goddess of fertility. Crops would come upon prayer to Asherah. The herds and flocks would produce well if you prayed to Asherah. Not only, of course, was this diametrically opposed to the monotheism, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Jehovah God, but this was an ugly, ugly cult. In order, if you can believe this, in order to curry the favor of Baal and Asherah, the Israelites were encouraged to go to the shrines and the temples and engage with the prostitutes. Thus, Baal and Asherah, upon seeing how the people engaged in their behavior, would do the same in the heavenlies, and the rains would come, and the crops would grow. It didn't stop there. At times in their worship frenzy, the priests of Baal would slash themselves with knives. Blood would flow, but the worst was yet to be seen. When they were truly committed, they would sacrifice children to Baal and Asherah. This was the threat. This was the power. Israel's historic faith was not only now threatened by the frontiers, but from the very palace itself with Ahab and Jezebel. It was in this time that Elijah arose. People were now living in fear. No one dared challenge Ahab and Jezebel. The prophets were being killed. Those who dared to stand tall were struck down. Here came Elijah. Chapter 17, verse 1. Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither rain or dew in the next few years, except at my word." Who is this guy? He bursts onto the scene. No mention is made of his mother or father, which is very rare when it comes to Old Testament prophets. It says he was, though, from the land of Tishbe. Well, where is that? The map shows you. Go to the eastern side there of the Jordan. There's where he was from. Samaria, that's the capital of the north. That's where he made his way to make his pronouncement there in 17:1. We aren't told a lot about him, but his name is interesting. The name Elijah is made up of 3 Hebrew words that literally mean, "My God is Jehovah." And as we'll soon see, he lived out his name. Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there'll be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word." If there would have been a musical score to this, they would have gone, da-da-dun. Because then he leaves. He leaves. You think, where'd he go? Well, I'll tell you about that next week. Why was this such a threat? You need to understand the climate. The climate of Israel, though Israel is the size of the state of New Jersey, the climate is like the state of California. And if you know anything about California, while it can be quite pleasant, it's borderline desert, isn't it? As such, the rains are everything. If the seasonal rains fail, the crops die. The grass withers. There's nothing to eat. This is not simply a threat of an economic slowdown. It's an economic shutdown. Life, as it would be typically lived, would cease to exist. Moreover, Baal and Asherah would be shown to be phonies. That's what was at stake here. Here's what struck me as I studied this. God had his people in crisis, right? He didn't raise up an army. He didn't send an earthquake. He didn't wipe out Ahab and Jezebel with a plague. He raised up an individual. An individual who said, "I'm not going to bow. I'm not going to cave. I'm going to stand for what's right. And I don't care what you do." I would suggest to you that God is still looking for those people. God is still looking for a young girl who says, "I know what the norm is, but I'm going to maintain my sexual purity. And I'm going to tell my friends to do likewise." A young boy who says, "You know what? In the classroom of the basketball court, integrity." A man on the job who says, "I'm going to do it God's way no matter what." A woman in her home, in her neighborhood, who says, "My home will be a lighthouse. My home will be different." How did he do this? Everybody else is hiding. How could he do this? I have 3 thoughts for you here in this introductory teaching. Here's the first. Elijah was convinced of the reality of Jehovah. Note his words, "As the Lord lives, whom I serve." It wasn't that Ahab didn't pose a threat. It wasn't this was some idle threat given by Jezebel. This was real. His life was at stake. Here's the thing. As much as he might have feared Ahab, he feared God more. As much as he was impressed by Jezebel, he was impressed by God more. See that phrase, whom I serve? I love the way in which the New American Standard renders the phrase you see by way of the screen. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand. Before whom I stand. Listen, Elijah did not bow before Ahab because he had bowed before God. And as real as Ahab was, God was more real to him. To the extent that God is real to you, to that extent, you're going to be able to take your stand. The psalmist wrote, "The Lord is with me, I will not be afraid. What can mere man do to me?" The Apostle Paul, who well knew what it was like to stand before kings who threatened his life, wrote these words, "If God is for us, who can be against us?" Elijah was able to stand tall when all around him were living small. Here's the deal. Such courage is not put on like a tattoo. The courage to maintain a stand for Christ in the midst of a culture that's anti-Christ is when you are so shot through with Jesus' reality that you realize he's more real to me than anything else I see or anyone else I'll face. And these things are byproducts of a person who's in touch with him on a daily basis. If I were to take a survey here, say, how many of you would like to be that one person? In your school, your shop, your business, your neighborhood, you'd be that person. You say, I want to take my stand. I'm not going to bow. I'm not going to cave. I want to do it. My guess is we get the majority of hands raised. So I ask you a second question, and it's simply this. How many of you are taking the time, how many of you are making the time to be shot through with the reality of Jesus enough to take that stand? You will never stand before men if you do not bow before Christ with regularity. I have yet to see a courageous man or woman who does not have a regular time in the presence of God. To be little with God is to be little for God. Get that? To be little with God is to be little for God. Only those who bow in private will have the courage to stand in public. Some years ago, I got a call from a businessman here at the church, guy I so respect. I know that he spent time with the Lord on a regular basis, very successful in his business. He was in sales. He called me. I remember the call because it was warm. I was wearing shorts outside. He said, I've got a real issue. I said, what's going on? He said, well, as you know, they bring customers in from around the country to look at our products. And as senior management, I'm required to host them. I said, okay. He said, so I take them to dinner and so forth. I said, all right. He said, a new mandate has come down. It seems like some of these guys who come in not only want to go to dinner, but they've heard of the gentlemen's clubs in Fort Wayne. And we're supposed to take them there. He said, Dave, I can't do that. I won't do that. I said, is your boss open to that? He said, no, I have 3 days to decide and then I lose my job. I said, we got 3 days to pray. So we prayed. 3 days later, I got a phone call. How's it going? Going great. Really? I said, yeah, my boss just got fired. Said word got taken upstairs of what he was asking of us. He just got fired and I just got promoted. I said, would you have done it had you lost your job? He said, I will never bow to any man who asked me to compromise Christ. How could he do that? Had a family, kids in college. How could he lose a job? Because he was determined that Christ was more real to him than any cruddy boss. And if you hope to take that kind of courageous stand, you're going to have to be so infused with that. Because you will not lack the challenges. Maybe not quite as dramatic as him, but you'll face them. And if you do not spend time with Christ, that issue will be bigger than he is. But Elijah was not only convinced of the reality of Jehovah, he was convinced that he was a representative of Jehovah. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives before whom I serve. He didn't have position or power. We don't know that he had any education or connections. But one thing he had was he had this sense, I'm an ambassador of the ultimate king. This idea of ambassadorship, you might be tempted to restrict it simply to Old Testament prophets, but Paul would say otherwise. Lifting our eyes and voices, let's read this on the side screen together. God has committed to us the message of reconciliation. We are therefore God's ambassadors. Let's read that second sentence together again. We are therefore God's ambassadors. What are you? You are God's ambassador. How do you get to be an ambassador? The king gives you the privilege. The president gives you the privilege. You now represent him to the rest of the world. As you live, so live all Americans, in other words. You are now representative of that. You're an ambassador. See, I think God is looking for ambassadors. Ambassadors who live with consistency. I think he's looking for them in the church. I think he's looking for them in the church parking lots. God's looking for ambassadors and among the people who wear the green shirts every fall and run for Race for Peace for Congo. But he's also looking for them in offices and shops, in gyms and neighborhoods, high schools and college campuses. Ambassadors. I'm called to be one, and so are you. Here's the thing. You can't take off the label when you want to. You're an ambassador all the time. One of the craziest things happened when we were down in Jamaica. People are wonderful down there. And they actually speak English, which really helps me out. I was going to breakfast one morning. Gwen was still changing, and I went to save us a place and get some coffee. Little waitress came up to me, pretty little thing. She said, "Excuse me, sir." "Yes?" "Do you happen to be a pastor?" I thought, oh, crying out loud. I can't get away from it even down in Jamaica. I looked at her, I thought, do I know you? She said, "No, I've never seen you before. But as I saw you walk in here, it's as if God said, 'That's a pastor, ask him for prayer.'" She said, I think I'm a child of God, but I haven't been baptized yet. So I'm talking to her about becoming a Christian. All the while I'm thinking, how are you doing this, lady? Gwen walks up. She says, "What's going on?" I said, "This lady here is quite perceptive. She sees a man of God in her midst." No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. In fact, Gwen hadn't come up yet. After it was over, I told her. And Gwen asked me this question she often asked me. She said, What do you think God is saying to you in that moment? I said, "I know what he's saying to me. You can't take it off and put it on. You represent Christ wherever you go. Never forget it." And that was a profound moment for me. A reminder to me that wherever I go, people are watching. You say, well, what if they don't know you're a Christian? Then you get another problem. If they don't know you're a Christian. Because hopefully, ultimately, your life will be different. But anyway, that's my story. I'm sticking with it. All right. Elijah was convinced of the reality of Jehovah. He was representative of Jehovah. And third, quickly, he was convinced of the resources of Jehovah. As the Lord lives, there will be neither rain nor dew in the next days except at my word. How could he say that? Well, we get a little bit of insight from another text. Ironically, it's in the New Testament. So now slide back as we prepare to wrap this up to James chapter 5. Right at the end of the New Testament is the book of James. And Elijah is mentioned as well as his resource. Elijah is mentioned in James chapter 5, verses 17 and 18. James 5, 17 and 18. It reads, Elijah was a human being even as we are. I like the way the old NASB renders it. Elijah was a man just like us. He was a man just like us. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain. And it did not rain in the land for 3.5 years. Again, he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crops. He prayed. Elijah believed that prayer worked. He just prayed. There's so much mystery about prayer, and some folks read this verse and take it as carte blanche, like a genie in a bottle. So whatever I ask, God's going to give me. And I'm just going to, pray for blanket healing of this and blanket resourcing of that, and I'm going to pray here, and God has to answer my prayer. Well, you know as well as I do that prayer is a mystery, and God's will is involved in this thing and the whole big scheme of things. But I think there's something to be seen here, and that is power is released when we pray that would not be released otherwise. Elijah prayed, and it says he's a man just like us. What would it be like if you prayed? He lived in these horrific times. Darkness was everywhere. Like our times, wouldn't you say? And we can complain, and we can criticize government policy, and we can go on Facebook and lambaste and threaten. I'm wearying of all that. What I want to say is this: why don't you pray as much time as you spend on Facebook? Why don't you pray for your government as much time as you criticize them? Why don't you ask God to do something in the hearts of men and women? Ask God to touch our culture. Let's ask God for some big things to happen. Elijah did, and big things did happen. We'll talk more about that as this teaching series goes on. Well, God found one person. I think he's still looking. He's looking for men and women. He's looking for a couple. He's looking for a family. He's looking for a small group. People who say, you know what? I'm convinced of the reality of God. I'm convinced I'm a representative of God, and I'm going to use the resources of God, and I'm going to make a difference in my world. Let's bow our heads, shall we? I want to ask you three questions, or two questions in three parts. First question: what is God saying to you this morning about the reality of Christ in your life? Is he more real to you than any human threat? If to be little with God is to be little for God, how much time are you with God? What would he say to you about your practices that make him real? And what are you going to do about it this week? If in fact, as in fact, you're a representative and people are watching in the gym, at the shop, at the office, in your school, around the neighborhood, what do they see? What would God say to you about your ambassadorship? What score would he give you? And what would he have you do about that? Finally, if the resources of prayer are that powerful, if truly history can be changed through prayer, what would he say to you about your use of it? How big are your prayers? How specific are your prayers? What would he say to you? And what would he have you do about it this week? Heavenly Father, all too easily we can dismiss ourselves from the story thinking, well, I could never be an Elijah. But I can't get around the fact of James' commentary, he was a man just like us. Just a man. But a man shot through with the reality of God, who saw himself as a representative of God and availed himself of the resources of God. And I'd sure love to be that kind of a guy. Our world needs them, men and women like that. And I don't want to be weird. I don't want to be obnoxious, but boy, I think I could be different, better, more. So do a mighty work in me and help me to live my life accordingly. In Jesus' name.